Hi, welcome to another episode of C4NPR Chats. If we haven't yet had a chance to meet, I'm Heather Bradley, the director of the center, and I'm so excited that Kathy Allen, the board doctor, is with us today. Welcome, Kathy.
Well, hello, welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, and Kathy is a friend of the center, and her history and relationship with the center goes back a long ways. And you may have used one of her tools. I'll talk about that in a minute. But Kathy has been an instructor at the center in the past. In fact, she holds one of the first certificates that was issued through our nonprofit management certificate course. And Kathy is a native of Port Clinton. And somewhere along the way, you may have heard me say, or you've used with me, the tool that I use most at the center, and it's the board governance and best practices checklist. And Kathy is one of the architects. She worked with my predecessor, Michelle Klinger, and we've updated it since then. But Kathy, I tell you, that's part of your legacy because we use that all the time. And so those listening, if you haven't checked that out, I'll make sure that link is in the bottom below, the description box below. But well, Kathy, overall, what are you seeing out there in nonprofit land and board governance? Like, what are you observing out there right now?
Well, thanks again for having me today. And it's just really delightful to get to talk about that master checklist, right? I had a lot of fun working with Michelle to put that together, and I'm so delighted that it's continuing to have life and people are continuing to use it and to get value out of it. Um, I don't have any crystal balls, and I don't think that my vision is particularly different from others. This has been a very difficult year for nonprofit organizations. So many programs have closed. So many events have had to be canceled. Meetings have had to get switched to Zoom and other things. And yet demand for services has gone up. So, the nonprofit sector, once again, doing more with less. And the landscape for planning has gotten a lot more difficult, but it's not less important. Groups still have to have a vision for even just what it means to come out the other side of this pandemic in a strong way, and figure out what their action steps are, what the priorities are, and be able to implement those things. So not a lot different from before, just harder, I think.
So is that the biggest challenge, or what do you consider the biggest challenges for boards going forward and board governance, the discipline?
So for board governance as a field evolves, an excellent example is that 15 years ago, we would have said, the board of directors has a role and the executive director has a role and there's no crossover. And in more recent years, we do recognize that there are shared responsibilities. Some things like putting together a budget has both the administrative piece and the strategic leadership piece, right? So there are shared responsibilities. The field is continuing to evolve as younger people and people of color have been putting together some really outstanding thought leadership to really lead out, to make sure that our organizations are operating in an equitable way, and that are focused on the purpose. And so I'm not entirely sure where the field is going to go, but it is moving. It's changing, I think, pretty dramatically. And I look forward to being a part of that and to following the leadership where it goes.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, by the way. I mean, it's
Yeah,
like I don't think there is one predictor. You've seen one
right.
board, you've seen one board, right?
That's right.
Um, but one of the things that helped reconnect us this time was I noticed that you had a new board assessment. And so
Mhm.
I'm curious, what had you create the new board assessment and how can our nonprofits use it?
So I was encouraged. You're talking about something called the Board Doctor's Wellness Test, which
Okay.
is a 10-question screening tool that's available free on my website, and it just asks just 10 questions that cover some of the basic maladies that we see when a nonprofit board isn't functioning well.
Mm.
Right. So it's a way that someone could go in, take these 10 questions and get an automatic sort of score to let them know whether their board is basically on the right path. Many of the people who take the wellness test find that, yeah, their board is basically on the right path. And others find that, oh my goodness, there's a lot that the board isn't doing, a lot of governance responsibilities that are sort of either being handled by staff or aren't being handled at all. And so in those cases, then boards may choose to do a more in-depth sort of assessment of how they're doing and begin to address any problem areas that they have. So the best practices checklist that I worked on, I once upon a time with the Center for Nonprofit Resources, has also continued to evolve, and it's a more fulsome tool now called the Board Doctor's Annual Checkup. And that's 100-item checklist of best practices in governance, financial management, legal responsibilities, fundraising, right? The responsibilities of the board. And so, boards can go through that process, and then with my help as facilitator, identify, their high priority action steps for making improvement over the next year or so.
Yeah. So for those of you who have used the checklist we have, you will know it doesn't give a score, much to the chagrin of some people who like scores.
Right.
So that's one big difference. It sounds like, self-assessment is nice. You can just do it and identify, here's where we're doing well, and here's where we might want to prioritize improvement or focus. Another thing that I'm really attracted to in what you just described is that it's 10 questions. I mean, it's like everybody can do that. You could have a whole board do it at a meeting and talk about results. So I will make sure that the link to your website is also in the description below this video.
One of the key findings is that when a whole group does it, we often find a whole range of opinion. 10 board members just answered the same question 5 different ways, right? And they're on that whole range. So that where I see that, or where people see that they have a difference of opinion as to whether or not we are thoroughly discussing the budget before adopting it, now we know where we need to have some conversation in the boardroom and get a meeting of the minds. Is this a problem, or is this an issue of maybe not all the board members have the same information, right? Maybe we just need a better orientation program for our board members. But for some reason, board members have developed different opinions about how well they're doing. So they need to have that conversation in the boardroom.
Great point. No matter what tool you use, it's usually a conversation starter. So we take a large field, a wide field, like or a topic like board governance, and it starts to focus and reshape the conversations in a meaningful way, right?
That's right. And I always encourage groups, set aside time in your agenda to do that. It's hard to do that in the course of a regular board meeting where you've got an agenda and you've got 12 minutes before you get to the next item, right? Take time to focus on the health of the board itself. And this kind of a tool, even the 10-question version, absolutely is just a great way to jumpstart that conversation. Just make sure you've made time for it.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm sure that if I asked 10 people, I'd get 10 different answers. So I'm just looking for, based on your experience and what you've been witnessing, how do you think the pandemic has implemented boards and how they work together, and ultimately how nonprofits operate?
So if you've seen one board, you've seen one board. I think the healthiest organizations have looked inward to do capacity building during this time to help build their organizational infrastructure. While some are still, learning the technology of having online meetings and that kind of thing, and shared document sharing and those kinds of technological resources as well. Other organizations are saying, well, this is a good time if we're not running programs now, so let's make sure that we're spending some time to build up the strength of the board. We'll assess how we're doing, what the board composition is, what kind of more board members can we be recruiting to work with us, focusing on other kinds of fundraising. I'd say that's another big change during this year. As events have canceled, organizations that were event dependent on their fundraising have had to learn other methods of fundraising, which can be more effective and certainly less costly than event-based fundraising. So
yeah, and I'm sure you've run into this, but one topic that definitely is under the microscope is the topic of financial reserves.
Yeah,
because for some groups at one end of the spectrum, it's like, what's that? And for others, it's, well, how do we know when and how to spend it? So what might you be observing about boards and their relationships to the reserves?
So, over the years, we have very carefully taught board members that they need to be in the black for a time period. So from January 1 to December 31st, we must be in the black. And as boards have carefully managed and brought their budgets in the black, if they've done it well, there's been a bit of a kitty that gets built up. Hopefully there's a policy in place where before there's a need, that board has discussed under what circumstances they would dip in and use that money, but often not. I have definitely met board members this year who even this year struggle with the idea that we're going to be in the red because we're spending some carryover reserve, right? And who would prefer to cut now than to even spend carryover reserve to get them through the year. So I've definitely been a part of some interesting boardroom conversations about that.
And I've seen some that had plans for that money and the plans had to be diverted to a later time.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I've seen some that had not planned for nor started compiling reserves. And some of them don't exist now, honestly.
Yeah.
So,
I think there's a special place in heaven for those donors, those foundation donors who have been willing to allow their grants to be converted to operating expenses, right? To switch the use of grant money from a program to some operating expenses this year. I've seen quite a lot of that, and I think that has been very, very helpful to keep the whole sector afloat. Still, we know that nearly 1 million nonprofit employees across the country have been on layoff this year. And so, like every other sector, we have a lot of work to do to rebuild and get back up to full strength.
well, we covered a lot of ground, Kathy, in a short amount of time. Is there
Yeah, we
anything
did.
else that's top of mind that you would like to share with our audience? You know them so well, having worked in Northwest Ohio, from Northwest Ohio. Anything else you'd like to share that I haven't yet asked?
I would just say that the nonprofit work that you are all doing, whatever your mission is, whether it's helping kids, whether it's serving veterans, whether it's helping to take care of our environment, it's important work, right? And it's important to do well. So the health of the board of directors, being able to do that governance piece well, helps you achieve more mission. So I encourage everybody to make sure that you're using the resources that are available at the Center for Nonprofit Resources, that you are getting professional development so that you can grow in your career, whether you're staff or whether you're a board member. Just make sure that you're paying attention to how the health of the golden goose so that you can continue to create those golden eggs, especially as we get through the end of this difficult time in our community. Thank you for taking care of my beloved Northwest Ohio.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us, Kathy. So there she is, Kathy, the board doctor. I'm going to put her contact information down below too. She now resides in the Carolinas, but I think one of the other things that we've discovered through COVID, some of us knew it before, is that you can get the expert you need, and geography is no longer a barrier. So feel free to reach out to Kathy with follow-up questions or even discussing her services. So thanks again, and we will catch you on another episode of C4NPR Chats.
All right.